The afternoon was bright and warm, the kind of day when families gathered in the park to enjoy the fresh air. Children laughed as they ran across the grass chasing bubbles that floated in the sunlight. Parents sat on benches chatting quietly, or laid blankets on the ground to share snacks. Couples strolled slowly along the paths holding hands while dogs tugged at their leashes eager to explore. Everything looked peaceful, like a picture that showed happiness and calm. In the middle of this peaceful scene there was one man who seemed out of place. He walked quickly holding a small toddler in his arms. At first glance it looked normal, like a father carrying his child, but if anyone looked a little closer, they might have noticed something strange. The man's grip was tight, almost too tight, and his eyes kept moving from side to side, scanning the park as if he was afraid of being followed. His steps were not steady. They were rushed and uneven, as though he wanted to leave the park without anyone noticing him. The little toddler whimpered softly, not the playful sound of a happy child, but a worried cry, as if he sensed something was wrong. Nearby, a Navy SEAL officer sat on a bench, dressed casually in jeans and a plain shirt. No one around him knew about his military background. To most people, he looked like an ordinary visitor enjoying the day, but years of training had sharpened his eyes. He had learned to notice the smallest details, the quiet signals that told him when something wasn't right. And now his eyes were fixed on the man carrying the toddler. Something about the way the man held the child, something about the fear in his movements made the officer's instincts alert. A few feet away from the bench, a K-9 unit was also in the park. A police handler stood holding the leash of a strong, trained German Shepherd. The dog had been calm moments before, but suddenly its body stiffened. Its ears perked up, and its sharp eyes locked on the man with the toddler. A low growl rumbled in its throat. The handler tugged gently at the leash, whispering to calm the dog, but the animal's instincts were louder than any command. It sensed something hidden, something wrong, and it would not stay quiet. The SEAL officer noticed the dog's reaction. In his years of service, he had seen how animals could detect what humans could not: danger, fear, and even things hidden from plain sight. He leaned forward on the bench, his gaze narrowing. The man with the toddler had stopped for a moment, glancing back as though he felt eyes on him. His face was tense, his lips pressed tightly together, and sweat shone faintly on his forehead. He adjusted the bag slung across his shoulder, gripping the toddler even closer as the child tried to squirm. The officer's heartbeat slowed in focus, not from fear but from the steady calm that came when his instincts told him to be ready. The atmosphere of the park had not yet changed for most people. Children still laughed, parents still talked. But for those who were paying attention, the SEAL officer, the police handler, and the K-9, the peace was beginning to crack. The dog barked suddenly, loud and sharp, causing a few heads to turn. Parents looked around, confused by the noise, but no one understood yet what was happening. The man flinched at the sound and quickened his pace toward the far exit of the park. His steps were faster now, almost desperate. The SEAL officer rose quietly from the bench, his tall figure moving with purpose but not panic. He walked in the direction of the man, not running, not shouting, but with the calm authority of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The K-9 pulled harder against its leash, barking again, its body straining toward the man. The handler frowned, trying to control the powerful dog, but his own training told him to trust the animal's instincts. Something was definitely wrong. The officer glanced at the handler, and in that single look, both men seemed to understand. There was no need for words. The dog's reaction had confirmed what the officer's instincts already knew. The man holding the toddler reached the corner path near the gate. He glanced back once more, his eyes meeting the officer's steady stare. For a moment he froze. His grip on the toddler tightened and the child cried louder, struggling against the hold. The sound made a few more families turn their heads, finally noticing that something unusual was happening. Murmurs spread quietly among the crowd, but confusion still covered the truth. Only the officer, the handler, and the K-9 understood the danger fully. The officer quickened his steps now, his eyes never leaving the man. He could see the fear in the man's movements, the way his hand shifted toward the strap of the bag, the way his body tensed as though preparing to run. The officer's voice was calm but strong when he finally spoke. "Stop." Just one word spoken firmly, but the man's shoulders jerked as if he had been struck. The crowd nearby heard it too, and they stopped moving, their eyes shifting toward the unfolding scene. The park's peace had turned into a quiet tension, like the air before a storm. The man did not stop. He pulled the toddler closer, almost hiding the child against his chest, and moved faster toward the gate. The dog barked again, louder, straining so hard that the handler almost lost his grip on the leash. The officer's steps grew longer, his body moving with trained precision. He was closing the distance, but he knew this moment mattered. Every decision, every second could mean safety or danger for the people around him. His eyes went once more to the bag slung across the man's back. Something about its shape, something about the way the man protected it even more than the child, made the officer's instincts surge with certainty. Whatever was in that bag, it was the real reason the K9 reacted. The officer's chest rose with a deep breath as he prepared to act. Around them, families were beginning to gather their children, sensing the danger though they did not yet understand it. Parents pulled little ones closer, couples stepped back, and voices whispered with fear. The once happy park now held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. And in the middle of it all stood the man with the toddler, the officer moving steadily toward him, and the dog, pulling with all its strength. Three figures locked in a moment that would soon change everything. The man kept moving quickly, clutching the toddler so tightly that the child's small arms pressed against his chest. The toddler cried louder now, his voice carrying through the park and drawing more attention from the families nearby. Parents glanced at one another, uneasy, while some began picking up their children and stepping away. Something about the scene didn't feel right, even to ordinary people who knew nothing about military instincts or trained dogs. The K9 barked sharply, pulling with all its strength toward the man. Its handler struggled, his boots sliding against the path as the leash grew taut. The dog's body leaned forward like a spring ready to snap. The SEAL officer glanced at the handler and gave a subtle nod. It was a quiet signal, but clear. The officer's calmness gave the handler confidence to loosen his grip just enough to allow the dog to guide them. The man's steps grew faster. He almost jogged now, heading straight for the far exit gate, his head turned again and again, his face pale, his eyes darting like a trapped animal looking for escape. The bag on his back shifted with each hurried step, heavy enough that the strap dug into his shoulder. He adjusted it nervously, his free hand pressing it down as though he feared it might fall. The toddler squirmed harder, his little legs kicking against the man's side, but the man only tightened his grip, his jaw clenched with determination. The SEAL officer's pace matched him. His long strides closed the distance slowly but surely. His years of experience told him not to rush wildly, not to make sudden moves that might push the man into panic. Calm control was his strength, and he carried it like a shield. His eyes locked onto the man, and in that steady gaze was both warning and authority. The officer didn't shout, he didn't demand, but his silent presence grew heavier with every step closer. The dog suddenly lunged with even greater force. Its growl turned into a bark that echoed across the park, startling people nearby. Children clutched their parents, frightened by the sound. The handler stumbled forward as the K9 nearly dragged him, but he let the animal lead. The dog's instincts were too sharp to ignore. Every muscle in its body strained toward the man, its focus unbroken. Finally, the dog leapt. Its powerful body soared forward, teeth bared, not to harm the child but to block the man. The impact wasn't on the toddler but on the man's arm and shoulder, knocking him sideways. He staggered, his grip slipping for the first time. The toddler cried out, nearly tumbling from his hold, but in that instant the SEAL officer was there. Moving with precision, the officer reached out with strong arms and steadied the child, pulling him gently to safety while still keeping his eyes fixed on the man. Chaos broke out in the park. Gasps spread across the crowd as people realized they were witnessing something far more serious than a simple argument or misunderstanding. Parents pulled their children close, some running toward the opposite side of the park. The once relaxed atmosphere was now filled with fear and confusion. The man fought to steady himself, struggling against the dog that clung to his sleeve. His eyes burned with frustration as he tried to pull free, but the animal's training held firm. The handler tightened the leash just enough to keep control while still allowing the K9 to restrain the man. The SEAL officer held the toddler securely, lowering him into the arms of a nearby woman who had stepped forward bravely to help. The child clung to her, tears running down his cheeks, but his small body finally free from the crushing grip that had held him moments before. "Check his bag." The SEAL officer's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. It cut through the noise of the barking dog, the gasps and the murmurs of the crowd. People froze at the words. Their eyes darted toward the bag slung across the man's back. Until that moment, most had not noticed it. But now, with the officer's command, everyone's attention focused there. The man twisted his body, trying to shield the bag. His reaction spoke louder than words. Fear flashed across his face, not fear for himself, but fear of what might be discovered. The SEAL officer took a step closer, his hand steady and ready. His eyes didn't leave the bag, and his instincts screamed that this was the real danger, more than the man himself. Another officer who had been nearby rushed in. He grabbed at the strap and yanked the bag off the man's back. The weight of it pulled his arm down as though it carried something heavy and unnatural. Without hesitation, he threw it onto the ground, away from the child, away from the crowd. The bag hit the path with a dull thud, its contents shifting inside. The SEAL officer dropped to one knee, his hands moving quickly. He pulled the zipper open, and in that split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide, their voices hushed in fearful silence. Inside the bag lay a mess of wires, metallic parts, and strange packets that did not belong in a peaceful park. It was clear now this was not an ordinary bag. It carried danger, the kind that could have destroyed lives if it had been ignored. Gasps of shock rippled through the crowd. Mothers covered their mouths, fathers pulled their children tighter, and some people stepped back in terror. The SEAL officer looked up, his voice calm but firm as he said, "Secure him." The dog growled deeper, pressing the man against the ground as the handler tightened control. The second officer placed cuffs on the man's wrists with quick precision, ensuring he could no longer fight or run. The toddler sobbed quietly in the woman's arms, his small fingers clutching at her shirt. She rocked him gently, whispering comfort, though her own face was pale from what she had just seen. The SEAL officer stood again, his tall figure commanding, his eyes scanning the crowd to make sure everyone was moving back. His voice carried again, steady and clear, telling people to remain calm and to step away from the area. His tone gave reassurance even as fear pressed heavily on everyone's hearts. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the distance. Park security and police vehicles rushed to the scene, their lights flashing red and blue. Officers poured out, quickly surrounding the area. They listened closely as the SEAL officer explained what had happened, pointing to the suspicious bag and to the man now restrained on the ground. Parents whispered prayers of relief, thankful that the officer, the handler, and the K-9 had acted when they did. The park could have been a place of tragedy, but instead, it had become a place of protection and courage. The crowd's fear slowly turned into admiration, their eyes lingering on the dog that had refused to back down, and the officer who had trusted his instincts at the perfect moment. The toddler's cries softened as paramedics arrived to check him. He was frightened but unharmed. The woman who had held him stepped back as the boy was gently lifted into safer hands. She wiped her eyes, whispering that she was only glad she could help. The SEAL officer gave her a respectful nod, silently acknowledging her bravery. The man pinned by the officers no longer struggled. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped as though he knew the fight was over. The dangerous bag lay on the ground, surrounded by experts who moved in carefully to secure it. Everyone else stayed back, their hearts racing as they thought about what could have happened if no one had acted. The park was no longer peaceful, but it was safe. And it was clear to everyone that the courage of a dog, the instincts of a SEAL officer, and the quick actions of a few had saved countless lives. The sound of the SEAL officer's command, "Check his bag," still echoed in the minds of everyone standing in the park. Those words had turned a confusing scene into one of clarity. People now understood that the bag carried danger, not the child, and the sense of relief that the toddler was safe mixed with fear about what might still be inside the mysterious pack. The K-9's sharp barking grew quieter as the handler pulled it slightly back, but its body remained tense, ready to leap again if necessary. The dog's instincts had been right all along, and the crowd realized it. The man on the ground no longer resisted much, but his eyes moved quickly from one officer to another, as if he was searching for some way out. His shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths, his lips pressed tight and his hands clenched into fists, though they were already restrained. It was clear he was still calculating, still thinking, even though the SEAL officer's presence stood over him like a wall he could not cross. The bag lay a few steps away, unzipped now, its contents exposed for everyone to see. There were tangled wires, small metallic devices, and sealed packets with markings that ordinary people could not understand. To most of the parents and children watching, It looked like a confusing collection of parts, but the fear came not from knowing exactly what it was. It came from realizing it was something that never should have been in a park filled with families. The SEAL officer remained calm as he crouched near the bag, scanning the contents with his trained eyes. He didn't touch anything further. His experience told him that one wrong move could trigger something unintended. He raised his hand, signaling for the incoming officers to secure the area. His voice was strong but calm when he said, "Everyone step back. Clear this section." People obeyed quickly, parents rushing their children toward safer spots, couples moving behind benches and trees. The once busy lawn was now empty in the middle, leaving only officers, the restrained man, the handler with his K9, and the SEAL officer himself standing guard near the bag. Police officers formed a circle, keeping the curious crowd at a safe distance. Some of them spoke into radios, their voices sharp as they called for the bomb squad and specialized units to confirm what the bag carried. Red and blue lights from patrol cars flickered across the park as more units arrived, their presence adding weight to the seriousness of the situation. The SEAL officer's attention shifted back to the toddler, who was now being held by paramedics. The little boy's tears had slowed, though his face was still wet and his eyes red from crying. He looked frightened, clutching a small toy that a paramedic had given him in an effort to bring comfort. The officer's gaze softened. He had seen fear in many places before, but it always struck him differently when it was a child. The child had no idea what had been avoided, no idea how close danger had come, and that innocence made protecting him even more important. The woman who had first taken the toddler into her arms stood nearby, speaking softly with the paramedics. She explained how she had stepped forward without thinking, her only thought being to keep the child safe. She trembled now as the reality of what she had done sank in, but the SEAL officer gave her a quiet nod of respect. Ordinary people often underestimated their own courage, yet in moments like this, it became clear that bravery was not only in uniforms but also in hearts that acted at the right time. The restrained man suddenly spoke, his voice sharp and defiant. He shouted words that made some people gasp, though they could not fully understand his meaning. He tried to twist his body, as though to block the officers from taking the bag further away. The SEAL officer stepped closer, his calm presence enough to silence him without even raising his voice. One look from the officer was enough to remind the man that resistance would bring him nothing. The dog growled again, its deep voice echoing like a warning. The man finally lowered his head, his shoulders sagging. Specialized units arrived soon after. Dressed in protective gear, they moved carefully toward the bag. The crowd watched in silence, holding their breath. Even the children, usually restless, seemed frozen by the seriousness of the scene. Officers worked methodically, using tools to inspect the contents without touching them directly. The SEAL officer stayed close, his sharp eyes monitoring not only the bag but also the man restrained on the ground. He knew that sometimes the true danger wasn't only in the object but in the mind of the one who carried it. Minutes passed slowly, each second stretching as people waited for the verdict. Finally, one of the specialized officers gave a nod, signaling that the immediate risk was under control. The bag was sealed carefully in a protective container and prepared for transport. The park exhaled as one, the tension loosening slightly though not disappearing completely. The SEAL officer straightened his back, his eyes still locked on the restrained man. "It's over," he said simply, his voice steady. Those two words carried weight. They reassured the frightened crowd that the danger had been stopped, and they reminded the man on the ground that his plan, whatever it had been, would not succeed. Whispers spread through the crowd as people began to understand the depth of what had just happened. Some parents hugged their children tighter, tears in their eyes as they imagined what could have happened. Others shook their heads, whispering gratitude that the dog and the SEAL officer had been there. The name of the officer was unknown to most, but his actions spoke louder than any title could. The K9 handler knelt beside his dog, patting its strong neck with pride. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice soft compared to the chaos around them. The dog wagged its tail slightly, panting, but its eyes never fully relaxed. It still watched the man as though ready to act again if needed. The SEAL officer glanced at the dog and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. He knew that without the dog's sharp instincts, this moment might have played out very differently. As the crowd slowly began to settle, a few people stepped forward to thank the officers. One father, holding his daughter close, said with emotion, You saved all of us today." His words trembled, but his gratitude was clear. The SEAL officer simply nodded again, his expression calm. He did not seek praise. His focus was still on ensuring safety until every last risk was cleared. The restrained man was finally lifted to his feet and led away by 2 officers. His head remained lowered, but his eyes flickered with anger and defeat. The crowd watched silently, some with relief, others with quiet fear at how close they had come to danger without even realizing it. The toddler was carried to a waiting ambulance not because he was hurt, but so he could be checked fully and given comfort. His cries had faded into quiet sobs, his small body leaning against the shoulder of the paramedic who carried him. The SEAL officer stood still for a moment, watching both the child and the departing man. His thoughts were steady, but inside he knew that this day could have ended in tragedy. He allowed himself a single deep breath, the kind that came not from fear but from the heavy responsibility of what had just been avoided. Around him, the park began to change once more. People started gathering their things, preparing to leave, not because the danger remained, but because the memory of it would linger. Families held hands a little tighter. Couples spoke in softer tones, and children clung closer to their parents. The peace of the morning had been broken, but in its place a new awareness had grown. Everyone now understood how quickly life could shift and how important vigilance was. The SEAL officer finally walked toward the paramedics, checking once more on the toddler. The child looked up at him with wide eyes, still frightened but calmer. The officer gave him the faintest of smiles, a silent promise that he was safe now. The little boy blinked, then buried his face into the paramedic's shoulder, clinging to safety. The officer turned back, his tall frame steady, his eyes calm. He knew his role was not yet finished. There were reports to give, details to share, and procedures to follow. But in that moment, what mattered most was that the park was still filled with families who could go home, children who could laugh again another day, and lives that had been protected. The crowd, though shaken, would remember this day. They would remember the bark of the dog, the sharp command of the SEAL officer, the sight of the dangerous bag, and the relief when it was all taken away. And though fear had touched them, gratitude now filled their hearts more deeply. The park that had once been filled with laughter and sunshine now looked like the center of a serious operation. Police cars lined the entrance, their lights flashing red and blue, casting colorful reflections on the trees and benches. Uniformed officers moved quickly but carefully, setting up barriers to keep the crowd at a safe distance. Yellow tape stretched across the paths, blocking entry to the area where the man had been stopped. Families stood behind the tape, whispering to one another in disbelief, holding their children close as they tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The restrained man was now seated firmly on the ground, his hands secured. 2 officers stood guard on either side of him. His earlier defiance had faded into silence, though his eyes still flickered with anger. He kept his head low, avoiding the stares of the crowd, but it was impossible for him to hide the weight of his failure. He had been caught in the middle of his plan, exposed not by force alone but by the sharp instincts of a dog and the commanding presence of a SEAL officer who refused to ignore small signs of danger. The SEAL officer stood tall near the center of the scene, his calm voice guiding the other officers. He explained what he had seen, the man's nervous behavior, the way he carried the child, and the K-9's immediate reaction. Every detail he provided helped build a clear picture of how quickly things had unfolded. The local officers listened closely, nodding in respect. Though he was not in uniform, the authority in his tone was undeniable. His presence gave them confidence that the situation was under control. Nearby paramedics continued to check the toddler. The child had stopped crying now, though his little body still shook with leftover fear. His small hand clung tightly to the sleeve of the paramedic's jacket, unwilling to let go. The woman who had bravely stepped forward earlier stood close, tears still in her eyes as she watched the child. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, her heart full of relief that the boy was safe. The K-9, though calmer, remained seated by its handler's side. Its chest rose and fell with steady breaths, its eyes sharp and alert. It had done its job with perfect precision, and even as it sat now, it looked ready to act again if needed. The handler patted the dog's back gently, his face proud. "Good work," he whispered, his words lost under the noise of radios and sirens, but his tone filled with gratitude. The SEAL officer glanced toward them, offering a nod of respect that carried deep meaning. He knew that without the dog, this day could have ended in a very different way. The specialized team continued to work with the bag, handling it carefully with protective equipment. Their movements were slow, steady, and exact, as if every second mattered. They secured it inside a special container designed to hold dangerous objects safely. Once the bag was locked inside, the tension among the officers loosened slightly. A lead technician gave a signal that the immediate threat was under control. The crowd behind the tape let out a collective breath, relief washing over them like a wave. Yet the park was still filled with quiet fear. Parents looked at their children with new eyes, realizing how close they had come to danger without even knowing it. Some whispered to each other about leaving, while others lingered, unable to walk away until they fully saw the threat removed. Everyone knew they would remember this day for the rest of their lives. The SEAL officer walked slowly toward the paramedics and the toddler. He crouched slightly so he would not tower over the child, his voice gentle as he asked, "He's all right?" The paramedic nodded, replying that the boy was unharmed, only shaken. The officer's eyes softened as he looked at the toddler, who gazed back with wide, uncertain eyes. The officer gave him a faint smile, the kind that carried warmth and reassurance. It was a small gesture, but it told the child more than words could. He was safe now. The woman who had stepped forward earlier also approached the officer, her voice trembling as she said, "Thank you. I don't even know what made me grab him, but I couldn't just stand there." The SEAL officer shook his head gently. "You acted with courage," he said simply. His words steadied her heart. She realized that ordinary people could make a difference even when faced with fear. By now, more senior police officials had arrived, their presence adding to the seriousness of the situation. They spoke with the SEAL officer at length, asking him to recount everything in detail. He explained again how he had noticed the man's nervous behavior, how the K-9 reacted, and why he had shouted to check the bag. His account matched perfectly with what others had seen, leaving no doubt about the sequence of events. The officials thanked him sincerely, their voices carrying respect for his actions. The restrained man was finally lifted to his feet and led toward a waiting police vehicle. His head hung low, but his silence spoke volumes. As he was escorted past the crowd, whispers followed him. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others clutched their children tighter, and many simply stared, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. The flashing lights reflected off the car as the door closed, carrying him away from the park. The crowd slowly began to relax, though the memory of what had almost happened stayed heavy in the air. Parents whispered to their children, trying to calm them, while older kids asked questions their parents struggled to answer. The once ordinary afternoon had turned into a lesson that safety was never guaranteed, yet it also became a reminder of the courage that could rise in the most unexpected moments. The SEAL officer remained until the last of the specialized units confirmed the area was secure. Only then did his posture ease slightly. He knew his work was not yet done. There would be reports to file and questions to answer. But in his heart he carried quiet gratitude that lives had been saved, that the toddler was safe, and that the dog's instincts had been trusted. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in warm golden light, families began to leave. Some stopped to thank the officers directly, while others offered grateful nods before walking away. The park was no longer filled with laughter, but it was filled with relief. The SEAL officer stood for a moment, looking at the trees swaying gently in the evening breeze. He thought about how ordinary the day had started and how quickly it had changed. He thought about the child's frightened eyes, the dog's growl, and the weight of the bag. Every moment had mattered. Every decision had shaped the outcome. As he finally walked away from the center of the park, people's eyes followed him. They didn't know his name, but they knew his presence had made the difference. And though the day had been shaken by fear, it ended with safety, courage, and gratitude. The officer didn't seek recognition. For him, the real reward was seeing families walk home together, children holding their parents' hands tightly, alive and safe, because someone had been watching when it mattered most. The park had slowly returned to calm, though the memory of what happened would not fade quickly. The flashing lights of police cars still lit up the area, but the dangerous bag had been carried away in a secure container, and the man who brought it was already on his way to a holding facility. People remained scattered around the edges of the park, whispering quietly, some still too shaken to leave. Parents held their children close, not because danger was still there, but because they realized how precious safety truly was. The SEAL officer stood near the path, his tall frame steady and calm even after all the tension. He had given his report to the senior officials and answered every question carefully. His words were simple, without exaggeration, but his account painted a clear picture of what had happened. Every person who listened knew that his actions, his sharp eye, and his decision to shout those 4 words, "Check his bag," had saved lives that day. The canine handler knelt down beside his dog, scratching its strong neck with quiet pride. The German Shepherd wagged its tail slightly, though its body still carried the tension of what it had just faced. The handler whispered, "You did it. You kept them all safe." The SEAL officer approached, crouching beside the dog for a moment. He patted its head gently, his voice low as he said, "He's the real hero today." The handler smiled, nodding in agreement. Everyone who had witnessed the moment knew that without the dog's instincts, the truth might never have been discovered in time. The toddler had been taken to an ambulance for one final check. His face was calmer now, though his eyes were still red from tears. A soft blanket covered his small shoulders, and he clutched a toy that one of the paramedics had given him. When his mother finally arrived, her face pale with worry, her steps fast with desperation, she let out a cry of relief as she ran to him. She gathered the boy into her arms, holding him so tightly that it looked like she would never let go again. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she kissed his forehead again and again, whispering words of love and thanks. She turned then to the SEAL officer, her voice breaking as she said, "You saved my son. I don't know how to thank you." The officer shook his head gently. "You don't have to thank me. Just take him home safe." But she did not stop. She hugged him briefly, her gratitude too strong to hold back. The crowd around them, though still shaken, felt a wave of emotion watching the reunion of mother and child. It reminded everyone that even in frightening moments, love and family gave strength. News reporters had begun to gather near the entrance of the park, their cameras flashing, their microphones held out toward officials. Word had spread quickly, and already the story of what happened was beginning to travel beyond the park. People who had been there gave statements describing the strange man, the toddler in his arms, the dog's sudden reaction, and the commanding voice of the SEAL officer that cut through the chaos. Every detail added to the picture of the day, but no matter how it was told, one truth was clear. Danger had been stopped because people acted with courage at the right time. The crowd slowly thinned as families decided to leave. Some walked past the SEAL officer, stopping just long enough to say thank you, or to offer a nod of respect. A father carrying his daughter on his shoulders paused, lifting his child's small hand to wave at the officer. The girl's innocent smile carried more weight than words, and the officer lifted his hand in return, his face calm but kind. As the sun lowered in the sky, golden light spilled across the park, softening the scene that had been filled with fear only hours earlier. The grass still held footprints of those who had rushed away, and the tape still marked the area where the bag had been found. But the sound of children laughing faintly at the far end reminded everyone that life was continuing. The SEAL officer stood for a moment, letting the quiet return sink in. He had seen many tense moments in his career, but this one was different. This one was in the middle of ordinary life, in front of families who had only wanted to enjoy a peaceful day. He thought of the small details that had changed everything. The nervous way the man walked, the tight grip on the toddler, the growl of the dog that refused to stay silent. None of these things looked important on their own, but together they had revealed the truth. It was a reminder that vigilance mattered, not only in battlefields but also in everyday places. Safety depended on noticing what others might miss and acting with courage before it was too late. The senior police officials came to him once more, shaking his hand firmly. "You prevented a disaster today," one of them said with genuine respect. The officer replied calmly, "We all did." The dog, the handler, the paramedics, the crowd that listened, every action mattered. His words carried humility, but they also carried wisdom. He knew no hero acted alone. Courage spread from one person to another, and that was what kept people safe. When the final police vehicles began to leave, the park grew quiet again. Only a few officers remained, keeping watch as the last families walked home. The SEAL officer lingered, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to be sure. He walked slowly along the path, glancing at the benches, the playground, and the open grass. He wanted to see the park again as it should be, a place of peace, laughter, and safety. And as he walked, he noticed the canine trotting beside its handler, still alert, still ready. He smiled faintly, knowing that loyalty and instinct like that were priceless. At last, when the sun had nearly set, the officer left the park. He didn't leave with fanfare or attention. He didn't stay for interviews or praise. He walked away quietly, blending back into the rhythm of ordinary life. But for those who had seen him, he was unforgettable. Parents would tell their children about the calm man who noticed what others missed, about the brave dog who barked when no one else understood, and about the small command that changed everything. That night, news channels across the city carried the story. Headlines flashed. Canine dog exposes threat in park. SEAL officer's quick command prevents disaster. And toddler rescued in dramatic park incident. People watching from their homes shook their heads in disbelief, realizing how close the city had come to tragedy. But alongside fear, there was pride. Pride that heroes, both in uniform and out, were among them. Pride that courage could still be found in the quiet actions of those who cared. The next morning, as the park reopened, families returned cautiously. Children played again, though parents kept a closer watch than before. On the grass near the playground, a small group of people had placed flowers not for loss, but in gratitude. A handwritten note lay among them, reading, "Thank you to the heroes who kept us safe." It was simple, but it spoke for everyone. The SEAL officer, though not present, would have understood the message. For him, the reward was not recognition, but the knowledge that families could laugh again, that the park could be a place of joy once more, and that the child he had saved was back in the arms of his mother. In his heart, he carried the quiet satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. The canine, too, returned to its routine, but with a new glow of pride from those who knew its story. Children pointed at the dog when they saw it on patrol, whispering, "That's the one that saved us." The handler smiled, letting the animal enjoy the affection. The dog didn't understand fame, but it understood love, and that was enough. In the end, the memory of that day lived on not as a tale of fear, but as a story of courage. A man's suspicious behavior, a toddler's cries, a dog's growl, and a single command had woven together into a moment that saved countless lives. And though the details might fade with time, the lesson would not. Even in the middle of ordinary life, heroes walk among us, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in plain clothes, always ready to act when it matters most.